So this class is Abbasid Banquet Culture. We're going to be talking specifically about banquets in the Abbasid Caliphate. We're going to go over a little bit of who the Abbasids were, what was expected of diners, what the etiquette was, what the social role of banquets was, and then we will wrap up with what was actually served in banquets. So probably the most important thing to start with here is what actually was the Abbasid Caliphate. So the Abbasids, very, very specifically, this is not a generalized Middle Eastern, not a generalized Islamic class. This is specifically about this one caliphate. However, this one group um, rules over an incredible amount of area and has a really expansive rule in one form or another. Um, However, they're really at their peak from the middle of the 8th century into the 10th century. One of the, let's see, two, oh, go back. Well, I can go ahead and move on to this one. This map is not all Abbasid Caliphate, but you can see the green, the purple, and the orange area is where they have control really at their peak. There's a lot of desire at certain points in time to take Al-Andalus in what's modern day Spain, but they never really quite get there. However, they do maintain both diplomatic ties and trade relations, basically from the Atlantic to the Pacific for several centuries, like up into really the rise of the Ottomans. In some capacity or another, because there are times where like they're effectively overthrown and another group rolls in and like takes their capital or pushes them out. But for a lot of those time periods, the Abbasids themselves are kept in place at least as ceremonial figureheads. So as far as like if we were having a class about who's actually in control and who's got the military control and who is controlling the government, that changes a lot during this time period. But kind of an odd thing happens with the way that they maintain at least a ceremonial position of ruling is they maintain a lot of influence over the culture. So one of the big things that happens with the Abbasids very early on is they're really the second major Islamic group to arise after, well, Islam is founded. It starts out with the Umayyads, and then the Abbasids overthrow the Umayyads. There's basically a civil war, which actually breaks up the Umayyads empire a little bit, which is why there is that aforementioned kind of desire to get their hands on Al-Andalus for a little while. And they have some back and forth with some places that the Umayyads had under control. They don't end up taking all of it, but they do end up having, again, like they have connections with Tang Dynasty China. They end up with connections with Scandinavia. Have diplomatic connections with the Carolingians. They are so spread out. Completely unrelated to this class, but I was doing some research on the history of indigo and found where they also had trade connections down the eastern coast of Africa, that they were trading cloth and they were trading dyestuffs. Really, really extensive trade network, really broad diplomatic ties. And one of the early things that they do is they found an entirely new city. The Umayyads had had their capital in what's modern day Syria, and they shift it to the east. They go to a site that had a previous city roughly on that spot and was very close to where the city of Babylon had been even further back. So it's not like they're just going out into the wilderness where there is nothing. They are going to a place that is a repeat location for cities. But there they found their own new city to be a new capital. And there are a few times through the history of the Abbasids where their capital shifts somewhere else. There's another town called Samarra that's really actually very, very close to Baghdad. It's just a little bit to the north that does come up for a brief period of time. They moved the capital there. It's probably most pertinent to this class because there's just more from the heyday of the Abbasid Caliphate that survives there than there is from actually Baghdad proper. There's really not a whole lot in ninth and 10th century Baghdad that made it to the modern day. Um, there's a fair bit of the archaeology that survived in Samarra. Um, and this remains a pretty major center of Abbasid power, even even when they are not having it as a formal capital, all the way up until the Mongols sack it in the 13th century. So I bring up Baghdad specifically because Baghdad is an interesting supporting role character in the food culture that comes out of the Abbasid culture. I think in the modern day in the US, most people don't necessarily have great associations with Baghdad and definitely don't. The first thing our minds jump to typically is not international center for trade and culture and learning and science. But in the golden age of Islam, it really is. This is one of the places where you have libraries and you have schools and you have doctors that are being trained. This is a central location for advancements in technology. You have people from a variety of other cultures all across Europe and Asia and even parts of Africa that are coming here and participating in this society. And what probably goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyways, is any culture that stretches hundreds of years, there's going to be some variation in this. So there's definitely times that are exceptions to this. You have rulers that are more friendly and less friendly, but as an overall, most of the time during the Abbasid Caliphate, Baghdad stays a pretty notable center of learning and a center of trade. This creates an interesting situation where, because the city has this booming economic situation that is very centralized, it's also the center for the military and it's the center for governance. It creates this new social structure that you could argue is kind of a middle class in a society that didn't really have a well-defined one before, and with a lot of social mobility and a lot of room for cultural exchange. And it creates this, and it's also, I should also probably note, like you can see on the map here, the River Tigris runs straight through Baghdad. The Euphrates is very nearby. This is smack dab in the middle of what was earlier known as the Fertile Crescent. This is a very fertile source of a lot of different food. Like this is a very prolifically fertile place as far as food production goes. And keep in mind that even though this is on some really extensive trade routes, we're talking about a point in time in history where you do have some food that travels across trade routes, but that's not typically like a main um, main thing that is getting traded long distances. You do have some, like we definitely have even earlier than the Abbasids, you have things like evidence of the Romans shipping grain and olive oil and wine. There is evidence and discussion in letters and documents and even poetry of wine that is being imported by the Abbasids from Carolingian holdings. Like there's definitely some edible things being exchanged from longer distances, but having a prolifically fruitful region creates this interesting situation that was kind of ripe for almost a foodie culture to develop. So that leads us to banquets. I do want to note before we talk about the roles of banquets that what we were talking about with banquets, I want to be real specifically, this is not about just food in the Abbasid Caliphate. This is specifically banquets. So this is not how your average person ate most of the time. Even among the elites, there's discussion of like going and eating in the marketplace. Some of the court poets, and even members of the ruling family write poems about things, food things that they see and smell in the marketplace. So this is not the be all and end all of what people are eating. However, banquets in this culture are serving some very specific functions. So we have hospitality expectations. Not everything among the Abbasids is defined by religion. However, it definitely does come into play. And there are social expectations that predate Islam that have also been, at this time period, really pushed further along by the additional pressure of religious obligation to provide hospitality to guests. It is very important that when you have a guest, you are offering them food and drink. However, going beyond that, this is also an opportunity to project an image. And what I mean by to project an image is this is an opportunity to paint a picture of who you are or who you would like to be. To host a banquet is an opportunity to show off your wealth, to show off your power, to show off how well cultured you are. Sometimes it can be to show off your authority, to assert your authority, to give and project an image of authority. They get used in many, many different ways. And sometimes you would generally think that feeding people projects a positive image, but there are cases where this is used as a war of hearts and minds kind of approach. There are some points in time where they are going into villages that they have conquered and hosting a banquet. And generosity and hospitality expectations come into play there, but also that authority comes into play too. Like we will feed you, but just FYI, just so you know, like this is where you're going to be provided for, so fall into line. There's also celebration. So again, going back to that part where faith definitely plays a role. You do get religious elements in celebration. So you have things like a feast in Ramadan is definitely going to be something that you were very likely to find banquets. But also you have celebrating victories. You don't get a empire as expansive as the Abbasids did without having some military victories. This was definitely not territory that was attained through diplomacy for the most part. It was mostly through conquest, and there's definitely banquets being thrown to celebrate conquests. There also there are some holidays and celebrations that actually predate the rise of Islam in the region that continue to be celebrated even through the Abbasid period. Some of them even today. Navroz, which if anybody attended Golden Lily this year, that Bren Maddock hosted, that was based at least on the concept of Navroz, which is a Persian, it's technically their new year, but it's at the spring equinox. And especially after you get past the first couple of Abbasid caliphs, there starts to be a increasing amount of interest in celebrating holidays that fall outside of Islam. And then you start to get things that I think modernly maybe we wouldn't necessarily expect. Like they start celebrating Easter, they start celebrating Christmas. And in some ways, I guess you could compare that how a lot of the US celebrates many of these things, where they know that they are religious holidays, but not everybody celebrates them as religious holidays. And you start seeing that banquets are being held for some of these holidays too. They are also used to build loyalty and alliances, much like you would have a state dinner today. If you're having visiting diplomats, if you are having visiting delegations, if you are just trying to build a connection with another family, if you are trying to create an alliance or cement an alliance, you might say, we're going to forget this slight and we're going to invite you and all of your people to come and have a banquet with us, and we are going to let bygones be bygones and break bread together and move forward and all just move on into the future positively together. But also, sometimes you say that, and that's not actually what you do when they get there. So, has anybody watched Game of Thrones? The Red Wedding is based on like there were a few different incidents in history that George Martin cited as inspiration for the Red Wedding. The way the Abbasids actually came into power is one of them. I feel like this is not a running theme that shows up a whole lot through the Caliphate's time period. However, if you Google Abbasid banquet, I guarantee you what is called the Banquet of Blood will be the first thing that comes up for you. Because one of the first big moves that they made after they initially assassinated the Umayyad leader who came before their rise was they basically did this thing where they said, we're going to have a banquet to build loyalty and to build alliances and to rebuild our relationship and figure out how we move forward together and just generally share goodwill. And when they got there, they killed them all. All right. So, one thing that is majorly different if you have learned about Western European feasts and court meals and court banquets is most of the time what you're talking about in Western Europe is going to be royalty and nobility. Maybe if somebody has really, really put themselves in the good graces of somebody who is in one of those categories, maybe they might also be included. But it is just that upper echelon, top steps of the social hierarchy. In the Abbasid Caliphate, that is not true. So, literally anyone off the street could potentially be invited to sit at a banquet. Some of them are specifically held for people living in certain areas. Sometimes they are being held in a way that is technically invitation only, but is semi-public, and sometimes they truly are within the palace. However, even being within the palace does not necessarily mean that it is limited to the court. As such, there's still etiquette for everyone, and even guests who are not part of the court are expected to meet at least a bare minimum standard for dining etiquette. There are actually books that get written on dining etiquette because it's not excusable to not know. In fact, though we'll get into this a little bit later, but one of the cookery manuscripts from this time period has chapters that are literally titled "When Eating with Your Betters." So it's not that it's so egalitarian that they're unconcerned about social status. However, that is not the defining line of who is actually going to be involved in these meals. So, what are those expectations? What are those minimum standards? This really goes beyond knowing what to do at the table, but it definitely includes it. Your showing up correctly for a banquet is going to start before you ever show up to the banquet. The Abbasids really, really believe in appropriate clothing for the appropriate place. Like there is a time and a place for what you are wearing when, and it does vary. And they have opinions about a whole lot of details on that. As an example, it's specified that you are expected to wear specifically cotton undergarments if you're going to be attending one of these banquets because it was believed it minimized perspiration. And you really weren't supposed to be showing up sweaty, and it wasn't really scent was very important. In fact, if you could afford it, it was encouraged to show up perfumed, but not just with any perfume. There are opinions on what perfumes are appropriate for which people. Oh man, my typos just made it through spell check at a alarming rate here. You should have been definitely well groomed, not well groomed. And what grooming included was things like your hair should be brushed. If you have a beard, your beard should be combed. It could potentially need to be clipped. There should definitely not be food particles or anything having accumulated in it, any debris. Hands definitely needed to be clean, but in addition to having clean hands, also your nails should be neat and also short. You're expected to show up with an empty stomach and preferably having been active before the meal, but you also should not show up sweaty and you should not show up at a point where you're like ragingly hungry and having trouble resisting the temptation to just like dive into food because that's also not considered acceptable. Also, there is my images that I'm including here are all either from the Abbasid period in the areas that they controlled, or they're related to. There's a few manuscript illuminations that are of scenes from the Abbasid period, but that were done later. But I do want to draw a little bit of attention to this one. And as you go back, the very first image of a bowl has a person on it, but almost everything else that you find from the Abbasid period does not actually have people. It's interesting to me where they picked and chose which features of restrictions on what Muslims were supposed to be doing that they were particularly worried about. And one of the things that they weren't particularly worried about avoiding alcohol, especially in the upper class, but they were fairly concerned about not depicting in a realistic manner living things. So you find a lot of these stylized animals and plants. And I think I personally think they're really gorgeous. So this one is a carved stucco panel. There was a column header on the previous one. We do still have a little bit of art from this time period that actually does show people. Not a ton of it. This one's a manuscript out of 13th century Baghdad, so it's right before the Mongols roll in, but it is technically from within that time period. So humoral theory in banquets. Going back to where Baghdad plays a role in this, Baghdad itself being the center of learning, there is this huge interest in humoral theory that had been kind of originated in among the Greeks, or at least they took it from the Greeks. It isn't an exact replica of what the Greeks believed, and it definitely changes again before it shows back up in force in Western Europe. But it's really important in banquets. It's very, very important among the social elites. It is part of that culture and part of that being cultured and being well educated and knowledgeable. There was an expectation that people who are eating at these banquets should have at least some understanding of how the body works and how it works with food. However, some of these elite members of society, especially the caliph, have a cheat code. Their personal physicians are expected to consult on what actually goes on the table, and they're even in many cases expected to sit with the caliph and advise them on every single bite of what they should be eating, what they should be tailoring to themselves, what they should eat more of and less of, and what should balance the humors between this dish and that dish. They also advise against eating certain things, and I have two stories about Harun al-Rashid. One of them is on here. And I'm going to tell this one first or read this one first because I think it's the great lead up to the second story. So I think this paints the most perfect picture of how important the physicians truly were. So one of the caliphs in the early 19th century, so really when the Abbasids are at like peak power. He's written about by somebody who is present in his court as requiring everyone to wait at the table. Everyone had to just sit and wait because his physician showed up late to dinner and they weren't sure where he was, and he ordered a house-to-house search of the entire complex to find his physician to come and sit with him to advise him while he ate his meal and would not start the banquet until he could be located and brought in. On the flip side, the story that's not on this same caliph is known for liking food a lot, and relatable. But one of the foods that the physicians generally advised against eating, or at least eating a lot of, is eggplant. It shows up in Al-Waraq, it shows up in Al-Baghdadi as advised against eating too much of because it just sits hard on the stomach and all of these other things within the humoral theory that it does this and it does that and it's not good for you. So while it was that important for Al-Rashid to have his personal physician present with him at the banquet, he valued that opinion so much that he was known to eat plates upon plates upon plates of eggplants all in one sitting. So that one, I love that combination of stories because it always raises the question to me of like, how much of this is that they really, really had dug into this and like believed it versus, I guess willpower is always a role and just like temptation, but how much of this is also just like a flex? Physicians are definitely consulted regardless in meal planning. The predominant theory is about how food actually sat in the stomach, which is a whole thing. I can do a whole hour-long class about on this whole theory, but it's because it is fascinating and there is a lot to it. So this is definitely Just FYI, this is the basics. But they have an entire theory that goes way beyond the Greek humoral theory on how food actually sits in the stomach and how the way that food gets layered into the stomach affects digestion and how it impacts the person who consumed it. And that affects everything from like the temperature of water that they suggest people drink and how much of it and what the progression of dishes should be and what garnishes should be applied and what spices should be used, which specific dishes people should eat and how much of each one. And even for the specific dishes that they eat in the progression, what the temperature of serving of those dishes should be. It gets very, very intense. They also have a lot to say on hygiene. And I have to say on this one, I'm very impressed because there's a lot of stuff that they have to say about hygiene that suggests to me that they don't understand germ theory yet. Like we don't have microscopes. We're not looking at things under magnification. We don't know about microbes. But they have noticed the cause and effect because there is such a huge emphasis on hygiene. Both the Awaric cookbooks and the al-Baghdadi cookbooks put a huge emphasis on really extensively what feels like almost excessively cleaning cooking vessels and the preparation of food. Now keep in mind, most of what's being used as cooking vessels at this time period is unsealed pottery, meaning it's porous. Now, there are ways to create a barrier. Some of them work better than others, some of them last longer than others. There are ways to season a pot. However, there's limits on how much that works. And if they are in a hot and humid environment, I don't know if anybody has ever mishandled and poorly stored a clay cooking pot. You absolutely can open up your clay cooking pot that you cleaned, you thought within an inch of its life, and then stash in a back corner where it was nice and damp and warm because it was, in my case, it was summer in the South. And you take the lid off, and there's mold spots that have grown inside your theoretically clean cooking pot. This is in modern day Iraq on the banks of a river, or at least specifically Baghdad is. I mean, you could say the same for a lot of their the places that they settled into in Syria and in modern day Egypt. Lots of close vicinity to large bodies of water and very hot temperatures. That's a great environment to grow some things in your cooking equipment that you don't want in your food. And they must have noticed because our work provides really extensive, I would say suggestions, but they're really more like regulations for palace kitchens on how cooking vessels should be cleaned. And al-Baghdadi goes so much further than that. He literally says use it once and throw it out. Now, your average family absolutely is not going to be able to do that, but there is some archaeological evidence to suggest that in the palace kitchens, they may have literally been using a cooking pot once and getting rid of it. Hand washing, I mentioned previously with the expectations on diners, that is also an expectation in the kitchens. Neatly manicured nails that are very short, very clean hands, lots of hand washing. And I do mean lots of hand washing. This is not something that is limited to you wash your hands before you eat dinner. This is like hand washing between rounds. This is hand washing with every single thing that you're handling. You're washing your hands again between. Um, I feel like everyone I know who has a safe serve certification and had to go through classes on avoiding cross-contamination in modern kitchens would be pretty proud of their rules on hand washing. They also are having hands washed with some specific blends of herbs and spices. What they refer to as bunk comes up a lot. There's a lot of contention as to what bunk actually was. There's a couple of schools of thought that it might be coffee. There's a couple of schools of thought that it might be the bark of a specific type of tree. We don't know. There's a lot of it's really all educated guesses. My personal feeling is that coffee is a really high likelihood option, because a lot of the traits that are discussed as bunk having, coffee does have. Like it's pretty good at breaking down grease and helping remove dirt and oils off of the hands or whatever surface. I would definitely prefer soap over, but if that's not on your list of options, a whole bunch of antimicrobial things being rubbed on your hands is probably a good second best. Um, they're also using toothpicks to help clean the teeth and keep breath fresh. Toothpicks can be suggested to be out of very specific woods. Willow shows up quite a bit. And they're also having really specific rules around how they're actually handling food at the table, especially. We're, spoons are a pretty new invention at this time, and we don't have forks yet, but spoons become the main utensil at a table. And it was considered very, very important to use a new spoon for each dish. You have some people who are noted in letters and writings that survive as really taking this to a next level. There is this person is in Cordoba at the time, so we're actually outside of the Abbasid Empire, but there's connections, there's trade and there's diplomatic connections, and there's people who are either need to leave Baghdad or choose to and go and like settle into positions of power in Cordoba. And there is a man who leaves Baghdad, moves to Cordoba, becomes a vizier, and is one of the things he takes is this use of spoons, and he's known for having a one servant stand to one side of him at the dinner table and one servant to the other side, and one has a stack of clean spoons, and he takes a spoon and takes a bite and dirties the spoon and passes it to the other servant, and then gets a new one and repeats throughout the course of the meal. So there's some people taking this to a little bit of an extreme. And this photo that I put with hygiene is this bronze ewer that, again, if you notice that same theme of we're not doing a whole lot of depictions of people or animals, but we are doing very abstracted forms from nature. Mealtime etiquette. All right, so you have cleaned yourself up and you made yourself smell good and you have clean clothes on and your beard is nice and neatly combed and you have been active in the earlier in the day and you're showing up, but you're not showing up sweaty, but you are showing up hungry, but you're not showing up ravenous. You're ready. You're ready to sit down at the table at the banquet and be on your best behavior. So, mealtime is very important that you don't dive into the food. It is peak of rudeness to show up and start shoveling. You are supposed to converse politely over the dinner table. You are supposed to put those conversational niceties before food, before the eating part. You're supposed to demonstrate patience in how you consume the meal throughout the entirety of the meal. There is, I mentioned earlier that there are very detailed writings about etiquette. Al Warwick writes a cookbook that includes an entire section at the end of it about etiquette. Like it's all of these recipes and all of this information about humoral theory and how a meal should be composed. And then he gets to the end and says, and also, this is how you need to behave. And then you have Al-Jahiz, who writes what's called the Book of Misers. And he has a whole bunch of anecdotal incidents that he shares. He's got like little witty stories that are maybe fictional, maybe not. There's a little bit of snark in some of them. Sometimes it's poetry, so he presents some of this in the form of poetry. But one of the things I personally think is most entertaining is he also has a list of vocabulary. He has terminology for different types of ill-mannered guests that might show up at your dinner party. So he has the pot picker who takes from the pot before the food is actually served. The bread sponger who uses his bread to soak up the fat before anybody else has a chance to. The stone switcher mixes his date pits in with the person next to him so that he can disguise how many he's eaten because he doesn't want to look like a glutton. The biters who are effectively people who are double dipping. And then I like this one. The guests who are party crashers because you apparently have an issue at this time period with people who aren't invited deciding to show up. And he also has a whole lot to say about people who didn't wash their hands before they started digging in. And hand washing is just, it is a repeated thing through the meal, and it is not optional at all. It is expected that you are washing your hands and re-grooming yourself throughout the meal. However, it's also not always appropriate to do it at the table. So one of the things that is typically provided is that there is space away from the table to get up and leave the table and touch yourself up out of sight. And this can be a big problem if you do not. There we have a letter going back to our dude Al Rashid, who had really strong feelings about who he included in his banquets. And it wasn't necessarily about social hierarchy, social rank. It was very much about who adhered to this etiquette and who was a good dinner guest. Being a good dinner guest was more likely to open these doors for you than coming from a certain family or having a certain amount of money or holdings. Good behavior went way further. Which brings us to our next note, which is climbing the social ladder, which is the other thing these banquets are really, really good for. So climbing the social ladder is really difficult in the medieval period in most places. And honestly, within the Abbasid Caliphate, not necessarily a huge exception, but this is one way to do it. Because banquets are not at all limited to people who have a certain social standing, um, and having that social standing was not valued nearly as much as being a good dinner guest was. It meant that if you were known to be talented, if you were known to be poetic, to have an excellent grasp of conversational skills, if you were witty and charming and charismatic, if you were well educated, if you were well cultured, and you brought that to the dinner table and you could craft a conversation that was enjoyable for the attendees, and especially for whoever was hosting the banquet, which was not always the caliph, but we're mostly talking about banquets within the caliph's court. That was going to get you really unprecedented and otherwise not available access to people who are holding very high-ranking positions within the military, within the government itself, within the court. You could potentially even get access to the caliph himself. We have a couple of caliphs who make a practice. Our once again buddy Al Rashid has someone who I love letters when I'm researching things. I love finding letters of people complaining about stuff. And one of the things that you find multiple letters griping from courtiers about Al-Rashid is that he cuts them out of a lot of his banquets because he doesn't enjoy their company and he would rather have his attendants go out and bring in men that might be of lower social status to sit with him and to share his table and to be seated near him that he finds to be well mannered and well educated and enjoyable to be around and enjoyable to converse with over the dinner table. And he would much rather sit with them than even people within his own family. And for him, this is effectively like this is bringing in your entertainment over dinner. This is your, this your source of mental stimulation. But for the people that he's bringing in, they are getting direct access to the caliph himself. However, the flip side is that while all of these things might get you a seat at the table, might get you that access, really poor table manners could cost you your invitation or worse. We do have one example that's fairly well documented of that whole going back to that thing where a typical formal banquet was going to provide spaces where you could duck out and touch up your grooming without being visible to the other diners. Not doing that was not considered acceptable for anyone except the caliph. The caliph is allowed to clean up his beard and wash his hands and wash his face at the table. No one else is allowed to. However, we have one incident that's pretty well recorded where someone followed the caliph's lead and it was not just considered, it was considered a personal offense, but it was also considered absolutely disgusting to such degree that the caliph was not just offended, he was horrified, and he didn't just ask him to leave. He was banned from the city of Baghdad. So that brings us to the actual food that is getting served. Ooh. So food presentation. Presentation is critically important when it comes to the banquets. Some of the recipes is Ulwark especially. I keep referencing, but it's one of the best preserved and most extensive cookery manuscripts we have from this time period. It is so much information, and there's a couple of excellent translations. Um, so it's also relatively accessible information. Some of the recipes have more information about how to arrange them and display them and present them than they do about actually how to make them. So having them be healthy and clean and tasty was not enough. It was also expected that all of these not just be beautifully arranged, but they should also be aromatic. They should be scented. Some of the dishes would even have aromatic things you might not be super excited about eating modernly, maybe don't even taste super great, but they might be added on top just so that the dish is also aromatic, so it carries a beautiful scent. Things like ambergris, things like musk, which if you know what the sources for either of those things, most that's not really high on the list of the modern palate desire to eat for most people. Um, However, these were things that were very, very much appreciated because it was a beautiful scent. It added an extra layer to the presentation. Round platters are fairly popular, largely because they like to lay things out in ways that resembled flowers. You have quite a few dishes that are recommended as being served layered in patterns that create shapes like a lotus flower. And some of these things are like, man, they really, really layer them on. This is not this is really not, this is a very meat heavy cuisine. They do some vegetarian dishes, but that's mostly reserved for the people who are sick or maybe aging. And they're even garnishing with meats. They're garnishing with little meat patties that are sometimes cut into decorative shapes, small sausages, sandwiches, which what I'm talking about by sandwich is not necessarily what we necessarily modernly in the US think of as a sandwich, like not necessarily like thick slices of bread with stuff between them. But like very, very thin breads rolled around other ingredients, very often stuffed again with a yet another type of meat. It is not unusual to find some of these recipes for these layered dishes that might have 5 or 6 different types of meat layered onto them. They also are chopping up eggs to put on some of these, or cutting them into decorative shapes also. Herbs and vegetables get used for decorative garnishes. They also round shapes come up a lot. They also really like to describe cutting cylindrical vegetables into shapes that are round, like golden dinars, like coins. They really like to describe things as coin shaped or moon shaped. And it needs to be pretty. It needs to be layered. It needs to have complexity, and it needs to not just look beautiful, it needs to taste beautiful, and it needs to smell beautiful. Most of the food is being presented in large communal dishes, which also probably goes back to that whole thing about like hand washing, hand washing, hand washing, hand washing. Like I feel like I say hand washing a million times in this presentation, but it comes up over and over and over. Hands need to be washed. And it makes sense because of how much of this it's communal. Like so much of it you're expected to eat from the bowl that is closest to you, along with however other many people around you that might be the closest bowl to them also. So there's a lot of sharing that's going on, and there's lots of like heaped presentations of food, which abundance is important. That going back to the reasons for banquets, that image that you want to project, that wealth, the power, the authority, the presentation of food is another way to hammer those points home. Um, they like the presentation of things. It's so important that there's literally poetry that gets composed about the way that food is presented. So I included one on the slides. What a splendid green dish Kamar cooked, amazingly beautiful, free of flaws, put in midst of a bright silver platter with eggs on top, a show-stopping scene, green emerald embossed in silver, surrounded with eyes cast in gold. You have to really be thrilled with your food situation to be writing poetry, including books of poetry about it. There's another one I won't read the entirety of. Oh, if I can find it. Ah, here it is. That is not on the slide. There is roughly a page and a half long poem in our work about cookies. I love this section of it. Shaped like perfect discs of equal size, each of which the full moon resembles. As luscious as honey they taste, and like the breeze, sweetly perfumed, like silver and gold, white and yellow juxtaposed. So if you note in that section, because again, I'm not reading you a page and a half of poetry. They're talking about the size and the shape and the color and the taste and also the scent. And the way that it's arranged and the way that it all interacts together. It's a thing that just comes up over and over and over, and I love finding the poetry about food because they really do like they don't just lightly wax poetic a little bit. They're truly writing books of poems about the way food is showing up. Entertainment. This one I love also. Like I keep saying that I find this whole topic fascinating. So high quality conversation and the feast itself, the food itself, were very much like they were kind of the central entertainment to the banquet. However, we do find a lot of art from the time that shows banquets. And especially from later in the Abbasid period, and then the more complicated source to really like assess how accurate it is or not is we also have a fair bit of art that is from after the Abbasids are no longer in power, but depicting events from when they were. That they tend to show dancers and musicians, lots and lots and lots of dancers and musicians. So this image I trimmed down a little bit, or I zoomed in, which I don't like to do, but this one was the way this particular illumination has aged. A lot of the figures blend in, and it's substantially larger than what's shown here. And I think you start losing the figures when you see the whole thing. So I zoomed in, so hopefully you can see. You have you have the caliph who is up on this raised platform, and you have food being taken up to the caliph, and you have children climbing in the trees around, and you have this big crowd that is sitting around. And in the center of that crowd, and a little bit on the fringes, you have dancers, and you have drummers, and you have people playing various stringed instruments. They're having a banquet, and that banquet is including entertainment. We also have some written records, mostly in the form of letters to home from diplomats who are in the Abbasid court that describe various different entertainments that range anywhere from reciting poetry to specific musical or dance performances, acrobats. But one of my favorite accounts of court meal entertainment is they had included a group of women that were arranged artfully at the center of the banquet to effectively spin the banquet as a living statue fountain with jugs of wine that they dispensed the wine throughout the meal. All right, so dishes served in banquets. Discussed a little bit a minute ago about this is a very, very meat heavy um cuisine just as a whole. Jumping way, way back to the beginning of who's actually attending banquets and like, is this indicative of how your average person would eat? Everybody who's attending the banquet is getting fed this way. However, your average person is not eating this way most of the time. They are more likely eating a lot of legumes and a lot of grains and probably a fair amount of fresh vegetables because they were actually pretty well available. But probably not a lot of meat. Whereas meat is just it's really central in the banquets. I did a feast that was based on this concept that I knew I would have people who were vegetarian attending, and it was really difficult to both honor the reality of the dishes and the recipes as they were written and still have create a meal where there was plenty for vegetarian attendees to eat because even the vegetable dishes within most of the cookery manuscripts They're predominantly vegetables, but they still contain meat. So the exact contents can vary, but there does typically end up being a progression of dishes that's recommended. And I think this is fascinating to me personally because of the way it feels like this is a very long time ago in a very far away place. But consider if this format for a meal sounds familiar, that you're going to start with the cold foods, maybe more sour flavors, small bites, little things, the salads. Then you're going to have the hot dishes. The soup and then the entree type things, the larger, fuller dishes, the big trays of food. And then you're going to finish the meal with sweets. So if anybody has gone out and gone to a restaurant and had a multi-course meal, I mean, that's probably going to sound pretty familiar. Our work also describes a meal as being incomplete without at least one dish that includes bread sopped in broth. This sounds very, very simple on the surface, right? Like it's just bread and broth. Except these are typically served as platters that are just absolutely piled with stuff on top of said bread sopped in broth. They also really like truffle oil to add onto them. So, like, don't let the simplicity of that explanation deceive you. They also really like to use grilled meat dishes and platters just piled with them and an ongoing procession that could go on for an extended period of time during a meal as a demonstration of both hospitality and wealth. It wasn't necessarily in the form of courses, like where you were brought something, then it was cleared away, and then you got something else. This could just be like an ongoing barrage of more and more and more dishes of different grilled meats, and different baked and grilled and roasted foods, and different stews. Just keep them coming, basically. So water is the main drink that gets served. They do have juice recipes. They also do have, this is a common misconception, that I totally understand where it comes from because um, there are rules in Islam about alcohol, but going back to that part where different caliphates, different Islamic dynasties, they had different opinions on what really mattered to them. And the Abbasids really were not super concerned about alcohol consumption, but it did tend to show up in different settings, not necessarily at banquets. It was more, they tended to have drinking parties that were separate, but we do have some accounts of it being part of menus for banquets. So there's some flexibility on that. However, after the meal, there was a preference specifically for sweetened drinks that have rose water. And that goes back to that idea of not just flavor, but the aromatic, that whole multi-layered presentation to the food. There's also a practice of using salt, specifically seasoned salts or herb salts. So think flavored salt, not Morton's. That's recommended to both start and end a meal. So in some ways, this could be as much symbolic as it is actually nutritional. Like that is, it is a clear delineation of where the meal starts and where it ends. But there's also some flexibility. Again, like this is a culture that stretches out over several hundred years. Nothing is going to stay the same the entire time. You have different leaders who have different feelings about different things. So there's some flexibility, and while that might be the written down recommended practice, there's also the option to have fresh fruit and raw vegetables that might be offered before the meal has formally begun. Um, but the seasoned salt being used in the meal stays pretty consistent. And it is important to the Abbasids to clearly delineate when a meal ends because it is not a big thing to linger around the table after the meal has ended. So, to wrap up the class, the last big note about Abbasid banquet culture that is pretty well agreed upon for a few centuries of writing about their banquet structure is when the meal is over, we go to sleep. So this one again shows up with where the physicians are involved in planning the meals. It's kind of the opposite side of the coin from being active before the banquet starts is that after the banquet is over, the expectation is not to continue being active, it is to rest and to settle and relax and let digestion happen. And I'm a fan of this approach. All right. So, any questions?
You mentioned seasoned salt several times. Is that like modern seasoned salt, or maybe something like Lawry's?
So, I'm not actually sure how Lori's is made, and it actually might be pretty similar. There's a couple of different ways to do this. There's a bunch of very specific recipes that I think al-Baghdadi has a few, but I don't have that one at hand. And I know my I'll work a little bit better. But there's quite a few where you take herbs, preferably fresh herbs, and you grind them with the salt, or sometimes spices, and let them dry back out, and then that is served to open the meal and close the meal. And it has an I've done this a couple of times off of some of the recipes, and I found it, I guess to jump back slightly, I thought it sounded to me really complicated to just like we're just eating salt, like we're just eating salt. How do you do that? And then I followed a couple of these recipes, and I realized that when you follow them, it tends to get a little bit clumpy, and it actually makes it easier to actually pick them up um and eat them. Um and some of them included things like mastic, which is going to be, I mean, that's the way that you mix that in. It definitely could be comparable to how some of the salts that you're gonna like just go to the grocery store and buy a salt that has other herbs mixed in. So there's a couple of different ways to do it. And I don't know. I would say no, absolutely not, but I'm thinking about it and like really I don't actually know that it's really all that different.
I wonder if that seasoned salt was like the smoked salt I was given as a newcomer.
I haven't seen one for smoked salt. At least not at that I can not that's jumping to mind.
Why did they think eggplant was unhealthy?
Um, they considered it to be bad for the digestion. They considered it to sit heavy. If I'm remembering correctly off the top of my head, it creates black bile under humoral theory. Um, they felt like it wasn't good for you. If I remember correctly, it's also one of the other things they felt like it did was I it's a nice way to put this. It increased flatulence, which was not something they were big fans of. This is definitely a topic I enjoy deeply talking about. More than happy to share what I've got.
Did I hear you say that their humoral concepts were more complex than the European ones?
Yeah, I don't even know if I would necessarily say more complex so much as different. There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of stuff that they layered onto it that's like they assigned humoral properties to, but it wasn't necessarily exactly humoral theory. Um, Especially things like their ideas about the way food layered in the stomach. I find it very interesting. It really, and I think the terminology really is a little different than I think modernly we would describe a lot of these things. But if a lot of the sensations they're describing, the experiences that they're describing, I think most of us have probably felt at one time or another, like feeling overfull or feeling bloated, like the feeling of too much or the feeling of something sitting heavy on the stomach. Um, and some of the things that they describe, the heat rising from the stomach sounds remarkably like heartburn. Um, and then some of the things that they associate that with, those different experiences with, and the way food is layered into the stomach, I'm like, okay, well, I'm pretty sure if I ate round after round after round after round of food for 4 hours continuously, I I would definitely need to be making some really careful consideration as to what exactly I was putting into my belly and how those things were going to feel together. Because otherwise that explanation, that expectation that it's going to fill, you're going to feel overfull, you're going to feel like it's too much, you're going to feel like there's pressure in the belly, that things are not sitting right. Like, yeah, no, that makes sense, actually. They had ideas about like what digests first and what digests easiest, and um, ways to eat certain things so that they would digest faster because they felt like you didn't want them in your body for as long as other things might be okay to be around. And some of that I don't necessarily follow the logic for some of it based off of, just my experience as a human being who eats food. But some of it just makes a lot of sense. And some of the things like trying to think of a good example off the top of my head. There's certain foods that they get that come up as people with certain humoral tendencies may have certain experiences with them. And as I'm reading over it, I'm wondering things like, is in this case the humoral tendency, is it actually like lactose intolerance? Or are some of these things allergies? Because there's certain things they talk about that some people may not do well with them. Some people may experience these symptoms when they eat these things. And I do love the end of a banquet. You when you're very full, that the thing to do is lay down and sleep, because I'm just picturing um after every Christmas and Thanksgiving dinner that I've ever been to, everybody finding a spot to lay down and take a nap. Um, I think that one is very, very much a relatable experience that a lot of people have had or at least seen.
Would there have been children present at a banquet?
I think I said this earlier, but just FYI, sources matter. Um, and this particular source is after the Abbasids are no longer in power at all, by any stretch of the imagination. But this illumination is based on a story that is a series of historical notes about Iranian kings. Um, and it is not from the Abbasid period, but it is illustrating scenes from the Abbasid period. And if you look where I kind of zoomed in for the dancers, it cuts a lot of them out. But you actually see kids up in the trees.
So they were just watching. They weren't allowed.
Oh, I don't know that they weren't allowed because we do, especially for banquets that are being held in villages, that are being held in communities. Whole families are invited, but also like if you've ever tried to if you've ever seen kids attending feast in the SCA, just because they're invited and they're allowed does not necessarily mean they're super eager to stay in their seats the whole time. Lots of firsthand experience with that one, let me tell you. My younger children, it's definitely they would much prefer to be climbing the trees, throwing apples at the caliph than sitting in the seats. With that said, though, it probably is worth noting that in a lot of the later period artworks that are like the Ottomans illustrating things that came before them, you do see a lot more intermingling in those illuminations between genders. However, the illuminations we have closer to the actual or from within the actual Abbasid period, which again, there's not a ton of that, but there is some. You tend to see like women and sometimes children are on like platforms or balconies or they're in tents by themselves. So they're present, but they're like they're separated. They're apart. Now that said, that's not necessarily universal because you also do have to put not to not sugarcoat it, you have women who are enslaved who are not subject to the same social norms because of the social status that comes with that. So there's a lot of little details that affect who is where. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope good class and I hope this was at least some degree of new information. Um, yeah, thank you for all for coming.